Excellent. Alrighty. So welcome along to the presentation. I'm now going to share my screen with you, and so that you can see my slides. So today we're actually, no, wrong. We're talking about segmentation, which is a really important topic to discuss, because often we either try to do it and get it wrong, or we don't do it at all. And potentially the main reason that we don't get it right is that we haven't spent enough time in market, and we haven't actually seen things kind of evolve over months and years to properly understand, what happens within this marketplace and who does what and why they do it and how they do it, and what their preferences are and what their objectives and perspectives are on things. So we'll run through the top 5 types of market segmentation, and then we'll run through an example of getting it wrong, and then revising that and getting it right over the course of many months and years of research. So you guys already know who I am. I work for Business Station, obviously, and you're part of the program, so there's no more to explain. And so we'll just jump straight into it. And if you've got any questions, just feel free to send them in a quick message or save them for the end. And yeah, that'll be extremely helpful. So let's see if I can go full screen now. It doesn't have full screen here. Wait, this could be full screen. There we go. Okay, so just to, you guys probably have a notion of what market segmentation actually is. It's a technique which involves segmenting a target market into smaller, more defined segments, enabling a business to conduct stronger market research into customers. And it's always really quite important to know who your customers are and who they aren't. And then it's also quite important to understand how your products and services map to different customer segments. So you might have multiple stakeholders in a particular market. Some of them you can do one kind of collaboration with, and others you do a different kind of collaboration with. And the more kind of like business development experience you get, you understand how these things actually map together. But yeah, coming in from the outside, outside of market, it takes quite a while to actually figure out how the market's structured and how everything kind of operates. So yeah, most of the market segmentation insights that I've gained are from being at expos and just talking to a whole range of customers and seeing what they end up doing, whether they come back and want to talk more, whether they see the value in the kind of skill set and knowledge that I potentially can bring to the table. And then others, obviously, there's less of a match. So yeah, obviously, understanding who your customer is and who they aren't helps you to make more specific products rather than having like a generalized product that tries to serve everyone. You've got a really clear understanding of use case, and that's what users expect these days. They don't expect like a generic tool. They expect quite a high level of customization to their needs. And yeah, the most successful companies have obviously been able to get that level of knowledge and insight and have improved things as such. And yeah, obviously customer loyalty can improve when you better understand who you're serving and their kind of like psychological makeup and demographic makeup and all that kind of thing. So yeah, the importance of market segmentation is when you're in the market, sometimes you can discover new ways of creating value for this market that potentially others haven't at this point in time. So there's a whole discovery element to it. Improving your product development process. So often when startup founders launch into a new venture, they haven't done enough market research. And unfortunately, you can't just do market research on the laptop. You have to get deep. You have to, as Phil DeBella would say, you have to get into the river. You have to get right up close and personal with all of the different kind of stakeholders and clients and partners that you might bring together to make this whole machine work that you're trying to create. And of course, yeah, optimizing campaign performance. So the more that you understand a customer segment, the better language you can use to actually communicate with them. And so really good marketing copy comes from, you know, this kind of insight. Cool. So the way I kind of do it, because I'm in exactly the right place, which is obviously Queensland, to understand the Queensland market, it's taken me a couple of months to kind of understand what's here, who does what, how they do it, where the opportunities lie, how to work with different stakeholders and all that kind of thing. So I didn't really set a specific objective other than what was set through the Digital Solutions Program, which is to serve X number of, X thousand number of small businesses and startups. But, you know, every time that you potentially go to another expo or you conduct some sort of research, you know, sometimes it might be worth actually thinking about what you're actually doing there. What kind of data are you collecting? But what I find is that it just comes through over the course of time through different interactions. And the more feedback that you get, the quicker that you can make improvements and you can, yeah, like add more value quicker by understanding who does what and how. And then, yeah, obviously the way that your mind segments will become, you'll get a higher and higher resolution segmentation. So every time that I go to, so yeah, for example, yesterday I went to the Redlands Small Business Expo, just down at Alexandra Hills. And what I learned was that the Chamber of Commerce across there has got a really ambitious plan that we can potentially work together with them on in a way that we've worked in the past with other kind of governmental organizations. So you start to see that kind of patternation emerging just over the course of time. But yeah, I didn't really go in there with a preconceived idea about who would be there and what, yeah, you know, what kind of small businesses would be there, what kind of stakeholders would be there. I was just like open to going along and to, you know, investing that time and understanding. And yeah, it has made an incremental improvement in my understanding of how the market is structured in Queensland. So the types of market segmentation. So there's behavioral segmentation, there's psychographic segmentation, there's demographic segmentation, geographic segmentation, and firmographic segmentation. And if you get one of these wrong, then potentially there are consequences and you won't have the success that you deserve. So let's run through the definitions. And maybe, I mean, just from the names, you'd be able to tell what these kind of segmentations look like. At the start, you tend to think about things in terms of demographics. And then you start to notice behavioral changes between different groups and psychographic differences in different groups. But let's define what we mean. So it's quite a deep meaning, but effectively it's to do with the customer's purchasing habits. Like, how do they actually procure products and services? Who do they trust? Why do they trust them? That kind of thing. And what kind of, and are they changing their buying behaviors? Yeah. So customer loyalty, engagement levels, and that kind of thing are obviously a function of behavioral segmentation. So later in the presentation, we'll do an analysis on a typical startup founder, like how they kind of interact with products and services in the marketplace, and point out some kind of truths that I've learned over the course of time. And of course, startup founders obviously behave very differently to, say, government organizations or chambers of commerce or networking groups, and they behave a little bit differently to small businesses as well. And small businesses have changed their behavior quite a bit as well over the last kind of 2-3 years as they've been put under more pressure due to COVID. So we have noticed that kind of thing kind of evolving over the time, over the last couple of years. So psychographics. So that's more like beliefs, values, and yeah, instead of the demographic side, which is, you know, how you know, if you look at the outside of a person, then you see kind of the demographic information. They're this old, they're in this profession, they're in this, well, demographic. You could also call that geographic segmentation. They live in New York City, they're female, they earn a certain amount and they're single, versus psychographics, which is, yeah, I tend to do quite a bit of networking, and I also like to go to different groups, like different meetup groups and Eventbrite groups, and each group has a different set of beliefs, values, and yeah, kind of a different web of beliefs. And so you need to make sure that you're kind of communicating with someone that has the same or similar worldview to you psychographically. Otherwise, you know, there can be challenges in terms of communication with someone from a completely different walk of life. So yeah, do remember that just because someone looks like they're a buyer doesn't mean that they necessarily are, because it depends on how they perceive what you're doing. So for example, Raymond would know this really well. There are people that are really kind of pro crypto, pro blockchain, and really fascinated by it. And then there's a bunch of people that are kind of in the middle, and then there's a bunch of people that don't particularly care for it and don't see the value. So, you know, when you're collaborating with, you know, in a B2B context, when you're collaborating with other organizations and businesses, you have to make sure that you have a similar kind of worldview about how, you know, what the future looks like for crypto, and yeah, share the same attitude towards it, that it's generally speaking something that will improve the world as opposed to complicate it, for example. So yeah, it takes quite a lot longer to do this kind of psychographic analysis. It's not the kind of thing that is easily done, you know, in an afternoon. Takes quite a while to see what actually happens and actually shakes out. Then there's the demographics. They're the ones that we talked about before: age, income level, family size, education, gender, these kind of things, stuff that you can easily pick up on. Yeah, there are some correlations between, so for example, younger people tend to be more progressive on average than the older demographics. But of course, you've got people that are the opposite to that as well. So you get people that are still very progressive and well into their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So sometimes you need multiple filters to properly understand who you're dealing with, right? Let's see. So geographical, that's really easy. And it just depends on what kind of products you've got or service you've got. Obviously, countries, because each country has a government, and the government kind of moderates the rules of what can and can't happen and where the investment goes, where all your tax dollars go. It has a huge impact and has, and also each nation has the same kind of media, broadly speaking, on TV, and that obviously has an impact on how people think. And then within, you know, states like Queensland, for example, you get different, you can actually split the state up into different portions, right? So for example, the way people think in SEQ might be very different to, which is Southeast Queensland, for those that are not from Queensland. They think very differently to people in the far north of Queensland as well. And then you get people kind of, because people are used to their own kind in particular areas, then obviously they trust the locals more than they do, for example, someone from the exact opposite end of Queensland. And, you know, you get very different psychographic groups forming in those different places. And yeah, different cities and different towns have different mentalities. And then if you want to split things up on a sub kind of city level, then you've also got local government areas. So in Perth, the city of Perth is quite small, whereas in Brisbane, it's huge. It's the largest LGA in Australia in terms of population, and probably in terms of the, you know, the area that it covers. And then you can go down even further and you can look at suburbs. So yeah, you just have to recognize at what level do you need to do your segmentation. And yeah, I mean, country, obviously the federal government has an impact on how the country operates as a whole. So it's kind of like an average of everyone in the entire country. And then state level, obviously you've got a state level of government in Australia. You don't necessarily have that everywhere. So in the UK, for example, they don't really have states. They more have country level, and then all the way down into the LGAs, the kind of boroughs that are run by various political organizations. So yeah, do think about, you know, does this have an impact on your particular product or service that you're creating? So not all of the filters are necessarily applicable to what you're doing, but you need to give them some consideration to make sure you haven't missed something that comes back to bite you later because you haven't thought about it. So here's kind of a list of the kind of organizations that we do various projects with. And they're all different kinds of organizations. Well, actually, there are some that are kind of a little bit similar. So let's see. Actually, no, we've got kind of one of everything here. And each of these organizations relates to our organization in a slightly different way. So we have to customize. So actually Brisbane Business Hub and WOTSO are kind of a little bit similar, but they're quite different as well in many regards. And each collaboration is kind of set up slightly differently based on, you know, how big the organization is, how influential the organization is, what the other organization is trying to achieve, and what kind of segment they're actually serving. So different segments. So for example, GC Hub down in the Gold Coast in Varsity Lakes serves a very different demographic to the Brisbane small business community. But these two are kind of like Angel Loop and GC Hub are kind of similar in a certain respect. But yeah, then you have to look at, are we providing the resources because we're the bigger organization, or are they providing the resources because they're the bigger organization? Typically, that's how it works, you know. But obviously, in return, there has to be something that the smaller organization has to provide the larger organization in terms of value. So, for example, if we, you know, if we make an investment of some sort in a particular idea, then, you know, the smaller organization will potentially need to bring the audience or something like that to the collaboration. But it's really important to make sure that the organization that you're working with is pretty well funded or well resourced in the way that you're expecting it to. Otherwise, they can't really hold up their end of the deal as much as you would hope. So definitely make sure of that, because there's a lot of, like, I guess almost like phantom organizations out there, organizations that want to be organizations that don't quite have the structure in place, or they don't quite have the resourcing in place. And it's important to make sure that you're not in that situation if you're relying on receiving extra support from the organization. So today, let's look at my discovery, like customer discovery journey from ignorance to probably segmented market. So I'll run through some of the mistakes that I made along my journey. So I wanted to deliver what I would call product management services for startups in the UK. But at the start, it was, I was trying to serve the wrong part of the market. So I did have a few battle scars from trying to serve the wrong part of the market. The idea was to try to help startups avoid the classic errors as they build out their product. So there was obviously an element of advisory, but also product development at the same time. And so that sort of had me cut across two supply chains. One was the business advisory supply chain, and the other one was the product development supply chain. So, you know, in terms of segmentation, that causes all sorts of strange issues because you're cutting across 2 or 3 different markets all at the same time. So you need to have understanding of all of those 3 markets and where you fit and how you kind of triangulate into that sweet spot at the kind of the intersection of all of those. And that's not that easy to do. So often it's better to choose one market and then deeply understand that market, as opposed to kind of spread yourself across either different geographies or different segments. Yeah, because it just requires more energy, time, and effort. But you know, when you're starting out, you need to start somewhere. So you have to have an idea about where that somewhere, you know, you have to start somewhere, and you have to go out there and gather more data and to begin to put a picture together of where you need to fit. So the starting point was really going to a tech conference. So I went to invested about £150, and I went to a 2-day tech conference, and I talked to like 200 people. And it was pretty confusing, actually, because at the time I didn't really have any sales or business development intelligence or market intel, if you'd like to call it that. So I was really just trying to understand where the market needs were, where the current challenges were for the market. It was super overwhelming, and it felt that I was doing something completely out of the ordinary. And yeah, it was very difficult to understand what was going on. And I just kept going to more and more and more of these conferences, and it was quite confusing, right? Because there's so many different stakeholders doing different things. And obviously huge numbers of startups all wanting to achieve certain objectives, and all running into different challenges along the way. So I think one of the mistakes that I would have made at this stage was to try to go directly to the customer without trying to piece together a systemic understanding of how the market works. So just trying to go straight to the goal and have a shot. But at the time, that's kind of what I felt needed to happen. So it was a real challenge in that respect. Yeah, but in truth, I mean, when you first enter a market, you can't see how it all fits together. It just takes quite a bit of time to actually piece it all together. And the more time you spend, the more you look, the more you find, kind of thing. And so this unraveling process can take many months or years. And actually, this building here, this may actually be the consulate in the Australian consulate in the Strand. And one of the takeaway messages from the panel discussion was that it often takes a lot longer than people think, just to, like, you know, you're going from one English-speaking country to another. But it takes a lot longer, like 2 or 3 times as long to go to market. internationally as people expect. So they typically will under budget because they, the product's ready, it works in Australia, let's take it to the UK. And yeah, until you get there, you don't really know what's there. And you can't really, it's very difficult to outsource this business development customer discovery process to someone else, because, it takes a lot of time, and you need to see things on your own terms and make sure that their interpretation is an accurate one. So they're just like relaying to you what they saw, but you might actually see other things when you're there. So yeah, do take this into account. And if you're pre-launch, then you actually haven't gone to market at all at that stage, unless you've been having a lot of conversations and hopefully open ones with a range of different organizations that you might be able to work with. So in this case, we're talking about a B2B kind of orientation, a B2B product, taking B2B products to market. So the problems I encountered was that every startup was different and had different challenges. Product management meant different things to different people. And I was quite rigid in what I wanted to do and what I wanted to offer. So instead of taking a market first approach, I was thinking, well, I need to tweak like little bits and pieces of what I'm offering, but I wasn't open to like become completely flexible. And I was listening, but I wasn't really listening. And I wasn't at a stage that I could accurately hear what was being said, because I didn't understand how the market was segmented. So that kind of blocks your ears a little bit, because you're hoping for the world to be a certain way. And then anything that kind of challenges that notion, the world is that way, you're wanting to block out and focus on the dream of your baby growing up and developing into a scale-up. Yeah, it was more about pushing services into market instead of having them pulled out of me. That's the situation that I was in. So you've probably heard me talking about that in the past, but it's a really important dynamic to feel that traction and that pull of your services and products come out. So if we're to look at startups, and I'm sure you guys can relate to some of these. So most startups don't have huge amounts of cash lying around, so their willingness and ability to pay for things is quite compromised. And part of it is that it's coming out of personal finances and friends and family a lot of the time. So you're not wanting just to like burn, set fire to large amounts of money. And so what that means is that everything that the startup does until they get funded is very price driven. And that can cause issues if you think about it, because if you're trying to, you often will be like tempted to like cut corners as a startup and trying to do things for cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And that's not always the best approach, unfortunately. Can get people into a lot of trouble. Startups are often still learning what they're doing at the time, which is understandable. And if they get burnt by a particular kind of service provider or organization, then they'll be very shy to collaborate again. So they'll start to close in a little bit. They tend to only invest money into services they understand and believe are necessary. So there's a huge bias towards startups investing in tech development over receiving advisory service, for example, because from a tangibility standpoint, obviously tech development actually looks like progress, whereas having new insights and that's not necessarily something that startups tend to value in as much. So yeah, it's just the way it is. And I think we all do it to quite an extent. And they tend to love to go through accelerators and anything that's free or cheap or invest in them. So anything that's cash positive rather than cash negative, they've got a preference for. And startups tend to behave more like consumers than businesses. So they don't have an existing cash flow coming into the business. So all of the money that they're spending is quote unquote risk capital. So that changes their behavior a huge amount. So there's a lot of startups that absolutely should work with someone like myself, for example, but they're not willing to cut the checks and invest the money at a particular stage. And that means that I've obviously had to pivot. So psychographically, what I was finding from going to all these expos was that, startup, it was like rock and roll in the 1970s and 80s, right? Everyone had a band. And so over the last kind of 20 years, everyone has had a startup, it feels like. So you've got people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of walks of life who throw their hat into the ring and want to, change the world in some capacity and feel that startup is the way to do that. And it was difficult to communicate with the people because there's such a variety of different backgrounds that they come from. You've got people that used to do architecture, engineering, software development, design, law. Everyone's got their own mental models that they bring to the table to inform, what they think the most important elements of success look like. So we've discussed that. And also there's an element of fear, which is understandable because you're putting money and time on the table and you're not necessarily seeing a return immediately. So it's important. And so that obviously shapes the kind of psychology of people in the startup domain. Is there so demographic analysis of startups. So I was seeing a lot of super young founders in London, and often it seemed like they didn't have enough prerequisite experience or cognitive development to make the startup work, so that they were at quite a low stage. So it's an interesting graph that I just found when I was looking for images on what age people do startups, and actually the peak is between about 38 and 45, and actually that's the kind of age group that sees the most success as well. And that's actually mapped here. So actually it's the older demographic. So if you're a little bit older, you're into your 40s or 50s, then that's not necessarily a bad thing. You might have a little less energy, but that your way of viewing the world is a lot more, how would you say, accurate, because you've got a little bit more data to work with. And so often it makes sense for the advisors to be quite a bit older, and then their kind of mentees to be a lot younger. And then you've got the energy behind you, but you've also got a little bit of the sage knowledge and experience to bring to the table as well, and guide and help shape the situation properly. But older entrepreneurs can also have critical experience gaps as well, which need to be filled over the course of time. So, no one has perfect knowledge or complete knowledge of everything. And so we're all kind of trying to, do our best to source that experience and knowledge, hopefully not too expensively. So I had an idea that there were certain parts of London that thought certain ways. But what I kind of found is that, the demographics that I was trying to serve, how would you say, they didn't necessarily align with where people lived, because there were a lot of kind of fake it till you make it people, and they happened to live in the really fancy parts of London, but they were living in different kind of conditions to those kind of palatial townhouses that you see lining the streets of Kensington, for example. And also, so it's really important to understand that, so London's quite a complicated beast. And there is, for certain services, but not necessarily startup services, there is quite a bit of correlation between where in the city you happen to live and your kind of willingness to pay for a particular service. However, we found that psychographically, startup founders were very similar because they'd gone through a similar path and their mind had been kind of shaped in a particular way, irrespective of whether they, were living in Oxford Circus or they were living in Whitechapel, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. So at a certain period of time, I had these false customer avatars, like the Chelsea girl would have a lot of money, but then they come to you and they meet you in this really amazing, hotel that looks really plush, but actually there's nothing that really sits behind that. It's all a bit of a facade. So you got to watch out for these things. People are out there to trick you sometimes. Firmographic. Yeah, so if you look at startup organizations, they're often extremely poorly resourced and they draw heavily on personal funding and family funding, which obviously changes their attitude towards what they want to invest in and what they won't or can't. And yeah, the money isn't being replenished by existing products and service lines being successful. And often, so if you're going to work with an organization that's a startup, understand that you'll either have to put in the capital yourself, or you'll need to analyze what level of traction that they've got with their various products and services and see whether it really makes sense to do that partnership. So if you're a bigger organization, you can obviously partner downwards, but if you're a startup, you would never partner with someone who is at that same level, because otherwise, you both don't have market fit. So you don't really have a huge amount that you can add value. You don't have the amount of value you can add to another startup can be quite limited, I would say. And so lessons learned from that. So the big lesson learned was that I was targeting the wrong kind of customer altogether for quite some time. And it's very difficult to service these kind of organizations unless they have proper investment, and investment is not super common. It does happen though, but it's very difficult to come into contact with a startup that has investment at exactly the right time. It's happened from time to time. So came across a US-based startup that had received about $1 million Australian dollars of investment from some business angels, and they were really open to working properly and receiving a lot of advisory and having someone come in and help shape their venture. But often, startups will not want to make that investment. And so that creates obvious challenges along the way. So it's great that there's a service like Digital Solutions to help with that specific market problem. And so, that creates quite a bit of dysfunction because there's a lot of organizations trying to operate without sufficient cash flow going through them. So the only thing that I would say, when you're kind of approaching organizations like this, is just make sure that everything hangs together before you decide to embark on a collaborative effort. But the big realization is that startups are my users, not my ideal client. So the ideal client has to be a different kind of organization. It can be quite difficult to serve underfunded organizations because they tend to they can kind of sap your own resources quite heavily if you engage with them in the wrong way. So the revised segmentation plan was, let's look at organizations, like larger organizations, either through a joint venture partnership, which can be an extremely good go-to-market strategy, or not-for-profit organizations that have the backing of the government, who are interested in stimulating the economy in a broader perspective. And the users then can be anyone. They can be small business, because small businesses, obviously, it's becoming a lot more difficult these days, just because you know, you've got borders closed and all this kind of thing. And startups can be anyone. So I've talked to funded and unfunded startups, and hopefully have added a huge amount of value to both of those categories. So behavioral segmentation. So what I've noticed is that if there's kind of like a mutual understanding about what needs to be done, then there's every possibility that someone wants to work together with me. But if they don't, when not on the same wavelength, then obviously there's a lot of challenge. So they need to be attracted to the way that I think. So my product is actually my brain in this case, as depicted, and see value in what I can contribute. So that's the kind of behavioral, and hopefully it's not always the case. Sometimes, you know, someone will smile and you'll think, oh yeah, they got it. And then you'll hear later that they didn't get it. That was just them wanting to be polite and respectful, but actually they don't actually see the value. But you'll see from whether they, you know, you retain someone as a customer, if they are attracted to the way that you think and they do see value in what you're saying. That's the behavioral element that I look for. Psychographics. So yeah, in terms of clients, these are the kind of people that see value in what I have to offer as an individual. And then users, who are the startups and the small businesses, understand. So I call them pluralists. So they understand, okay, I understand this amount of stuff, but there are a whole bunch of things that I don't yet understand. And I'm happy to draw on other people's experiences to fill all of these different voids and holes that end up presenting themselves over the journey of learning. And different people have different life experiences and therefore perceptions of things. So yeah, that's quite high level of, how would you say, like cognitive development to actually understand that. And so sometimes it's a little bit tricky for me because I assume that people are at a much higher level than they actually are. So I need to bring myself back down to their meet them where they're at. And that can be sometimes difficult without being in the same room and without being able to understand who I'm actually communicating with. So that's something I need to consider. Demographic segmentation. So the people that I tend to work with kind of range from their late 20s all the way through to their 70s. And so, yeah, there's no real age or gender kind of bias. And yeah, there's no real, in terms of how much, you know, family income there is and all that kind of thing. There's not a huge amount of segmentation in this particular dimension for the people that I kind of serve. But I typically understand that they're a little bit older than your 21-year-old founder who's going out there for the very first time and learning all the basics. And then geographic segmentation. So I typically use channels. So for example, Business Station I see as a channel, and the channel that Business Station targets is Western Australia, Northern Territory, and Queensland. And I've decided Queensland is my core focus at the moment. Although Ram, I will be back in December. So if you want to grab a beer, then let me know.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, equally, I mean, sometimes it makes sense to find, so say if I did want to service the UK market, then, you know, I would need to find organizations that do something similar across in the UK. And I typically find that I can add more value to markets that I understand. Like, obviously I grew up in Perth, so I understand, you know, who's doing what there, and I studied there and I met quite a bit of the different industries that exist there. So I've got a fair amount of knowledge. But if you ask me to kind of be deployed into, for example, Scotland or something, which I haven't been to in the last 20 years, that might be a little bit more difficult because I don't really understand who's doing what there, you know, who the players are. But London, yes, I have spent a couple of months, or actually a little bit more than that, exploring what's there, and starting to get beneath the skin of the city. So I would say, having been in Brisbane, it's taken me about 5 to 6 months to start to get under the skin of the city. But if I was to go now and re-enter a different market, then I would have a better kind of pre-existing segmentation plan. If I was, for example, going to go to Manchester or somewhere like that, just because, you know, government organizations, while they're same, they're also a little bit different. But still, I mean, you can still make these little adjustments in real time if you need to, if you're aware that, okay, there are differences that are kind of important that we really need to make sure that we pay attention to. So firmographic, so users can be startups, but the clients have to be well-funded or have a properly commercialized service I can add value to. That's been my personal kind of shift in how I relate to the market. So there's a whole bunch of different places that, you know, I can add value to, all the way from working at a local government level, all the way up to the federal side of things, and then a lot of different not-for-profit organizations, and even in the commercial space as well. So having an understanding about where your services and products map to, I think is an ongoing process. And I like to actually, as I mentioned to Ram a number of times, and maybe yourself, Raymond, I like to track like the job market and see who's hiring what, why and how, and what kind of opportunities are coming, because it tends to evolve over the course of time. Some kind of roles, they are pretty static. Like, I've noticed that mechanical engineering hasn't really changed its definition too much. Obviously, you know, what technologies exist and to help engineers become more productive and more accurate in what they're doing, that's obviously improved. But fundamentally, they're still doing kind of similar things to what I was doing like 10, 15 years ago. Whereas other segments, like obviously related to digital, are changing at a huge rate of knots, and that's increasingly, and that's what makes this market exciting, but also challenging, because, you know, if you go and try and build something, sometimes the market accelerates away from you and there's nothing you can do about it, and you're kind of stuck with a product that was great back in 2017, but 2022, it's not going to be as competitive. So do you know, try to keep a read on all, you know, where the market for your products and services is heading, because it's not always intuitive where it's going to go. So implications. So let's review the implications of not segmenting or not segmenting correctly. So you might start to target the wrong clients and customers. I see this all the time with clients that come through the digital solutions program. And then you might have different kinds of buyer types as well. So you might have, so, you know, there's the market that you serve, and then there's the market that you don't serve. And then you start to need to slice up those that you interact with on even more of a granular basis. As I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of different stakeholders that I need to interact with, and I offer them different things. And through the conversation, I kind of get a sense about which couple they want to like kind of access or make use of or buy or partner with or whatever it is. Also, if you don't segment correctly, it dilutes your message and comms effort quite considerably. So often it's the case that you'll have a technical, you know, you'll have a technical product or service that you'll be able to deploy into every single vertical there is. However, the issue with that is that, okay, the back end's the same, but the communication, the front end interaction is quite different about how to like access clients, customers in that particular segment. So in certain regards, and this is definitely what the book Crossing the Chasm sort of suggests, is try to get a lot more granular and try to focus on one vertical at a time. And then, you know, that's a really good way of driving product adoption, because yeah, it could be the same tech, but you might need to actually brand it differently to access different market segments. Yeah, because it's solving quite different problems for different segments, even though it's the same solution. Yeah, and also, I mean, if you've got, say, for example, you sell a particular service to the aged care sector, right? If you've got a testimonial and a case study from that sector already, and then you try to sell within the same sector, then this communication will be a lot more recognizable to who you're trying to sell into, because you're like, oh, Bethany Aged Care, they bought this, you know, they bought from us in the past. And usually people in that segment will understand who their competitors or who the other players in the market are, particularly the top, you know, tiers of the market. So that can be a lot more relevant to them than, you know, some unknown brand from some unknown country has used the product once or something like that. That's a whole lot less compelling. So when I'm trying to, you know, clarify and make kind of like a compelling pitch, I think the clearer and the more specific you can be in terms of numbers, in terms of organizations, in terms of dollars, you know, the better, and the higher chance that you'll actually be able to sell a person on a particular idea or participating. So if they're not completely convinced, then they're going to not obviously take action. Whereas if they're fully convinced that this is a great thing, then they're gonna obviously wanna come along to the event or buy the product or use the service or whatever it is. And if you don't segment properly, then your customer and market understanding and intimacy can be extremely low. And this can be an incredible problem as well, because you're spreading all of your time and your focus and attention across too many different segments, and then you never quite get to know any one segment that well. This is a problem that I've had kind of more like socially actually in Brisbane, because I was like, where do I fit in Brisbane? Like, who do I get on with the best? And then you end up going to all of these other different types of events. But now I've kind of narrowed it into, okay, these are the right kind of age groups, and these are the kind of right attitudes. And then you know that you're in the right room. Whereas if you're with like teenagers or people that are, you know, way too old and talking about something that you can't relate to, then you know you're in the wrong place. So yeah, going deep, obviously at the start you need to go broad, and then you need to bring it all the way into something that very specific group of people that you know you serve, and you serve well. So great. Not sure how we're doing for time. Oh, perfect. That was incredibly perfect. So you're both part of the program already, but what I might do is I might share with the others who aren't so fortunate to be part of the program to think about, you know, what are their top 3 challenges at this point in time. And yeah, pretty much I want to invite people to join. So I'll just show you what I'm doing here. Join the program, and here are my contact details, and you can obviously scan this QR code and receive a lot of information about how to sign up for our program, and you'll get 3 hours one-on-one mentoring plus another 4 hours one-to-many. And actually Ram's been on probably 30 or 50 hours worth actually. I mean, probably not quite that amount, but Ram comes on an ongoing basis, which is great. So actually there's no limits we say 4 hours one-to-many, but actually we mean infinity. You can access this as much as you like, as much as you need in order to, you know, upskill and learn about new facets of running a business successfully. Excellent. Alrighty, guys, maybe over to you for comments. So I'll start with you, Raymond, because we've just heard from Ram.
The last comment that you mentioned about the infinity hours is very good. Actually, I think I sent you a message or an email yesterday or the day before, asking if I could see what's scheduled, because I was worried that I might miss something that might be more interesting than the track. But if it's infinity, then it's great. In fact, I have a note here going to ask you about if there's any product owner or product manager type of presentation that focuses on those kind of I guess sequence of, you know, prioritizing what needs to be done when you're a product owner or product manager. That would be great if you could share with us down the track, you know.
Sure. I've got some blogs on it because I used to focus a little bit more heavily on the product side of things.
Okay.
So yeah, I can share with you some of those. But yeah, it's a big area. Like, it's become more and more complicated.
So, I was just gonna say that, actually, and that's one of the reasons why I brought it up. But associated to that, I think key element, something that you mentioned in this presentation today, is what you see is not necessarily what other people see. Like, let's say you're in these events that you go to, and that's very applicable also to being a product owner or anybody in the group. Sometimes the vision that you have is not conveyed until you iterate it a couple of times. As in, it's not conveyed in the precise manner that you want the receiver to capture it. And that not only applies in the events that you go to when you're having these conversations, but also to being a product manager or a product owner. Sometimes when the guys that are coding it, they think they understand, and you think they understand, but something slightly different comes, and then it might take an iteration or two to get the message properly across. And the last comment that you mentioned, which is actually, I think, very valid, is to keep an eye on the job market. I think that's very good, because you see how, and not only the job market, but also the general keywords that associate to what it is that you're building, and you see how over time that changes. And what I'm working on, you know, a year and a half ago was limited in terms of what was available, and now there's a lot more discussion and conversations going around the identity piece. So very valuable, very nice. I appreciate it. Thanks.
No worries. Yeah, thanks for that, for the comments. And do remind me, I'll send you a link to the all of the videos that we do, so you can track them, Raymond, as they come through. Sometimes we don't plan them too far in advance, just because you know, we're coming up with the new content, right? Yeah, there will probably be a shift towards some of these events being offline as well. And of course, Ram, I'm not sure if you're headed across to West Tech Fest. Anyway, I'll just talk to Ram now. West Tech Fest in December, but I think it's probably worthwhile going along just to see a little bit more about how this whole industry comes together. You know, the innovation industry in Western Australia, and you know, who funds what and why and how, and who the main players are, that kind of thing, because I think that would be quite useful for you.
Yeah, this West Tech has been going on probably for the past 5 years or so, more than that. And then, of course, being in Perth, I'm pretty well aware of the various stakeholders or even investors and things like that. And then, of course, it costs quite a bit. So sometimes, you know, there are some, you know, free tickets available. Then I can explore that and see. And In fact, sometimes some international investors also come, and investors from East also come, some VCs. And so I met few of them at Cutting, through Cutting some programs. There used to be, even now, there is this WA Innovator award or something. So I happened to go there a couple of times and then get some contacts and then establish some contacts. So yeah, that is, yeah, if there's an opportunity, definitely I will go there and see how it's changed over the years. And then, yeah.
Excellent.
And also look forward to catching up with you next month.
Sure, sure. Any comments on the presentation?
It's been great, Tristan. I've been learning a lot, not only on this presentation, but throughout. So, yeah, this with in regards to ours, with our particular startup, behavioral and geographic and demographic could be, they could be applied. So, of course,
I think also firmographic as well.
Firmographic also.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key ones, because you can go direct to small business, or you can go through a channel, and I guess that would be one of the these will be two very different go-to-market strategies. So I think you're at that stage that you have to decide between which is more likely to be a successful execution. But anyway, let's perhaps discuss that over a beer when I'm back in Western Australia.
Yeah, sure. Look forward to that.
Excellent. Alrighty, guys. Thanks so much for coming. And if you know anyone that needs my support, then you know where I am. Particularly if you're going to like the Founders Sundowner across in Perth. That's obviously something that has a lot of founders that I can potentially help accelerate their journey in either a very profound, large way or in some small capacity. So I'm always obviously interested in doing that. So thanks, guys, and I'll see you both over the course of the next couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tristan. Appreciate it.
See ya. Bye.